Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. I'm Georgina Downer and I'm the host of Afternoon Light and the CEO of the Robert Menzies Institute. The Institute is a prime ministerial library and museum devoted to upholding the legacy and vision of Sir Robert Menzies, Australia's longest-serving Prime Minister. On Afternoon Light, we explore contemporary issues relevant to Sir Robert's life and legacy with leading thinkers from around the world. Thank you for joining us today. Hello, and today on the Afternoon Light podcast, we are talking to Dr. Thomas Wilkins, who's a senior lecturer in international security at the University of Sydney, and he's also a senior fellow with the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Lovely to have you on Afternoon Light podcast, Tom.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks, Georgina. It's wonderful to join you at the Menzies Institute and have this opportunity to reflect back on how Australia-Japan relations have prospered since the Menzies era right to the present day. Just a quick disclaimer that the views that I express here are my personal views and don't necessarily reflect the views of the organisations which I'm affiliated with.
Tom, I wanted to start our discussion going back to World War II and where Australia's relationship with Japan was at in the sort of ashes of the Pacific War. And can you paint a picture for our listeners about what was going on at that time?
So you asked about the fallout of the Pacific War in terms of Australia-Japan relations in the post-war period. Well, you know, the first thing to remember is that Australia was a key member of the British Commonwealth Occupation Force in Japan, stationed in the western part of the main island of Honshu and headquartered in Kure. And naturally, I think the feelings amongst Australian troops were still raw as revelations of Japanese treatment of prisoners of war in Southeast Asia began to emerge. But I think maybe the exposure that the Australian troops had to Japanese domestic society created a little bit of cultural understanding. And some of the troops that were stationed in Japan, they actually brought Japanese women back as brides with them to Australia. In terms of Australia itself domestically, I think public perceptions in Australia were very negative, and they were very much fueled by publications that appeared in or accounts that appeared in stories from returning Australian soldiers about things like the Thailand-Burma Railway of Death and the Sandakan Death March. I think diplomatic relations were fairly cordial but frosty, and that sort of really went on until the end of the Cold War. I think the main avenue for rapprochement between the two countries in the post-war and Cold War periods was the deepening economic ties that I'm sure we'll talk about a bit more later. And historical reconciliation was really sort of left for a future date. Nevertheless, it's important to remember that around the 1950s, Robert Menzies himself did make a very strong statement saying that hostility to Japan must go. It's better to hope than always remember. And I'm happy to talk more on the reconciliation issue going forward.
Yeah, it's interesting to reflect on what enormous change has occurred when it comes to Australian attitudes to Japan. My grandfather, Alec Downer, was a POW from 42 to 45 in Changi in Singapore, obviously held captive by the Japanese, along with many thousands of Australian soldiers there, and experienced pretty awful conditions by all accounts, and many of his contemporaries died during that time from malnutrition, starvation and maltreatment as well. So I know that for that generation there are many people who never ever reconciled Japan as a friend of Australia. They might have been accepting of Japan as an economic partner, but this sort of deep friendship, it's taken generations to change minds, and it's, and as you say, even in the sort of 50s, 60s, 70s, when the economic relationship was doing incredibly well, there wasn't necessarily that feeling of affection that we have today. In 1957, the Menzies government signed a commerce agreement, basically a trade agreement with Japan, and it was preceded by a visit by Robert Menzies to Japan. And actually in the Menzies collection here at the University of Melbourne, there are some lovely photographs of that trip. There's a couple of official photograph albums that were produced by the Japanese government and presented to Menzies, and they actually have a wind-up musical box inside them. So when you open them, they sing to you, which is very beautiful. But, you know, a trip that clearly showed Menzies was given a great reception and had an audience with the Emperor and, of course, the Prime Minister at the time, Kishi, who is the grandfather of the more modern-day Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who'd be familiar to many of our listeners, I'm sure. And then after that, the commerce agreement is signed, and that really, while it was unpopular, the portion of the Parliament and I understand a portion of the party room, the Liberal Party room, it was passed and ratified and opened up an extraordinary economic relationship, which today Japan is Australia's third largest trading partner. It's the second largest export destination for Australian goods, and Japan is the second largest source of foreign direct investment in Australia. I mean, amazing economic relationship. Can you talk me through how that economic relationship developed from that 57 commerce agreement, Tom?
Yeah, by all means. So, I mean, I think there's several stories or several phases to how we've got to where we are today, and the first one of those is obviously the economic foundation of the relationship, which was, as you said, a little bit controversial with the Australian public, given their historical memories, but of course not as sensitive as the security cooperation that we have today. So, I mean, what really catalysed the relationship was the demand for Australian raw materials in the rebuilding of Japan in the post-war period. And the Japanese themselves have acknowledged, just how crucial it was to receive the raw materials from Australia in order to go through their process of reconstruction, and then of course later on in the 50s and 60s their return to an economic boom, a sort of second industrial revolution. So I mean, iron ore and coal and so forth were really sort of used to feed and fuel this nascent economic boom. And that's what the 1957 Agreement on Commerce really sort of codified and facilitated. And so the trading partnership really developed to the mutual benefit of both parties. By the mid-1960s, Japan had overtaken Britain as Australia's number one trading partner. And, the economic connection with the motherland was further impacted going forward by the European Union joining the United Kingdom joining the European Economic Community in 1973. So by 1974, I think 70% of Japan's iron ore was coming from Australia. And, this was further codified beyond the Menzies era with a second agreement that built upon this path-breaking 1957 commerce agreement by the Menzies government, which was the so-called Nara Treaty, or the Basic Treaty on Friendship and Cooperation between Australia and Japan. And so I think this second iteration, which of course is beyond the Menzies era, but that Menzies had laid the groundwork for earlier, was really took the relationship to another stage in terms of the ties that have been built up economically. It sort of normalised the relations between the two, but going forward, of course, up until the sort of the 1990s, where Japan's economic bubble burst and its economy began to stagnate, Australia's primary trading partner shifted from Japan to China. But that's not the end of the story in terms of the economic relationship, because in 2014, Japan and Australia signed the Japan-Australia Economic Partnership by Prime Minister Abe and Prime Minister Abbott. And so the economic opportunities have continued to unfold, but just sort of in different ways. As you pointed out, very, very, very well briefed in terms of Japan being such a large investor in Australia. And I think, it's important to emphasize that, because that points to the sort of the long-term durable relationship and the level of trust that one has between investment partners rather than trade, which can be here today and gone tomorrow, as we've learned to our peril.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. And speaking of being victim of trade embargoes, Japan has also been the victim of trade embargoes from our northern neighbours. And I was there during the time when China stopped the export of rare earths to Japan, and rare earths are really important in the production of high-tech goods like mobile phones and electric cars, batteries, and over a territorial dispute, a spat in the Japan Sea, where the Japanese Coast Guard and a Chinese fishing trawler, or potentially not just a Chinese fishing trawler, had a clash. You then had this enormous backlash in China against Japan, and I think that's worth reflecting on. 12 years later, that Australia is not alone in having to deal with this sort of backlash when it comes to bilateral disagreements over various issues. And, it's how you deal with it. And people often say, we should look at Japan. They can handle the relationship with China really well. But Japan has had its significant challenges over many decades, probably many millennia really, and it's had its highs and lows. And Australia is certainly not alone in struggling with that.
It's probably worth just mentioning, in relation to the suspension of rare earth exports to Japan during that Senkaku's crisis, that now that Japan has started to diversify its supply chains to get more secure supply chains, it's encouraging Australia to fill some gaps in those critical minerals, including developing our capacity to develop rare earth metals for export. So I think that's a really key point.
Yes, I think that period really exposed how few options countries had when it came to sourcing their rare earths. And, the development within Australia and other countries, United States, had been wound back, and China had kept up with it. And of course, it was in a monopolistic position, and that's definitely changing. But it was, these supply chain issues have come back to haunt us again with the COVID-19 pandemic, where we realise we're overly reliant on one market to export us certain items. Again, just recently with the Ukraine crisis, Europe's realised, whoops, a bit reliant on Russian energy. Maybe we should have some diversification. But look, this does bring me, Tom, to the security relationship with Japan, which has become an absolute focus over the last 2 decades of the Australia-Japan relationship. Can you paint a picture how that has developed? Because that was very much a really significant step up from just an economic relationship. And Australia has a lot of really good economic relationships, but having a strategic defence security relationship with the country shows the relationship has moved to a much deeper level, a much more reliant and trusting level.
You're absolutely right, Georgina. And so one way to look at the development of our very strong bilateral relationship that we have now, as I sort of alluded to earlier, was these kind of phases. First, sort of an economic phase. Then, towards the end of the Cold War, political and diplomatic cooperation, including sort of cooperation on peacekeeping operations in Cambodia and so forth. And then I think that built up the necessary level of trust to embark upon what is now a very, very close security partnership, officially known as the Special Strategic Partnership. And, you can only do these things with countries where you have built up that trust over time, because security and defence issues and intelligence and so forth are so sensitive. What really catalysed the relationship between Australia and Japan was the way that in the post-Cold War period, and as it started to face challenges from a rising China and North Korea and various other ones, that it was looking around for new partners, and it knew outside of its central US alliance, and it knew that some countries it wasn't going to get very far with. There's still hostility with some of its Northeast Asian neighbours. It looked out to Australia and it said, "Oh, we can really do business with these guys. They're a like-minded regional partner. We have the same sort of values and interests in common: liberal democracy, fellow US ally, and we can really together profitably collaborate across a whole number of areas, especially, and this is really the most recent development in this, is our joint adhesion to this new Indo-Pacific construct and this idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific, where Japan and Australia, both together but alongside the United States as well, can sort of push back against some of the challenges that we see to the rules-based order there. And so, they've built up, Japan and Australia have built up a layered and complex institutional relationship under this strategic partnership mechanism now.
Yeah, and of course, a precursor to the strategic partnership and of course the Quad more recently has been the trilateral strategic dialogue that took place with or takes place with the United States. And that, I think that's really key too to the development of the Australia-Japan security relationship, is that we're both allies of the United States, Australia through the ANZUS alliance and Japan through its own arrangements. There are US bases in Japan on Japanese territory. There are US installations on Australian territory. So we had so many shared ties in that respect. So under the auspices of this trilateral strategic dialogue, we were able to form a regular series of exchanges on security issues, but sort of under the cover of this is a US alliance partner talk, and then to expand that to a bilateral level. And that was a big jump for Japan, which has obviously, given its history and the way in post-World War II it was remade, really, by the United States. Their new constitution drafted, sort of demilitarization of Japanese society and governance structures. Japan's outlook on security issues is quite different from Australia. They even have constitutional limitations as well that we don't have. So this was an enormous change in the way Japan interacted with partners aside from the United States, wasn't it, Tom?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for both Australia and Japan, the United States alliances and the United States presence in the Indo-Pacific is absolutely crucial for their security. But I think especially sort of during the Trump era, but perhaps a little bit before as well, both countries were starting to get a little bit worried that they had to do more themselves to buttress that American system. And so they wanted to do more alongside the United States, like the trilateral strategic dialogue that you mentioned, absolutely, but also to build a bit of sort of, not entirely independent, but sort of slightly separate capacity by building up their own, bilateral strategic partnership. And they did this. This happened before the Trump administration, but where the really sort of foundational document, the real watershed for the bilateral security partnership between Australia and Japan was the 2007 Joint Declaration on Security Cooperation. And, where basically the countries said, we see the region, through the same kind of geopolitical lens. We're determined to uphold the rules-based order, ideally with the United States, but we're going to have to shoulder some of the burden ourselves and see what we can do ourselves. And so, now you have things like annual Leaders Summit meetings, annual foreign defence ministers meetings, which all result in joint statements. So you can, see exactly what the bilateral Australia-Japan position is on a whole range of different challenges. But really just to use this as a platform to engage the region through this sort of joint sometimes we say middle power cooperation, although Japan is more than a middle power, and show that these middle powers or secondary powers are making their contribution alongside the United States, but with other like-minded countries that want to participate as well.
I think it would be worth, Tom, talking about Japan's own security situation, because it shares a common outlook with Australia on how the Indo-Pacific should operate, that it should be free and open. There's a rules-based order. But Japan has several territorial disputes with its neighbours, and I think gives Japan it is in a particularly tricky strategic position. I mean, Australia doesn't have the territorial disputes like Japan does with China, with Korea, with Russia and Taiwan, of course. Can you talk through the impact of those territorial disputes on Japan's strategic outlook, and what sort of strategic posture that gives Japan that is quite different from Australia in terms of its direct threats?
Yeah, that's a very important issue, I think, for Australians to understand within the context of how close we've moved towards Tokyo in recent years. So, I mean, to sum it up, Tokyo repeatedly uses the phrase that they inhabit a increasingly severe security environment, and that they're on the front line of Northeast Asian security challenges. So they've got friction with China, which comes from the shifting balance of power and China's massive economic and military gains over the last couple of decades, and the way that it's actually expanded its influence and pressure upon its neighbours. If you look at the creation and militarisation of artificial islands in the South China Sea, this is replicated. I mean, Japan is worried about that, but it's even more worried about the East China Sea, where they have disputed territory. I mean, on the Japanese side, there's no dispute, but China disputes it. And so China has repeatedly sent both naval and naval forces and fishing fleets and so forth, and also air sorties into that territorial zone of Japan, and Japan is constantly forced to respond to this pressure. At the same time, Japan has gone on record about its concern over any conflict in the Taiwan Strait, with, of course, Taiwan being a close but unofficial partner of Tokyo, and its territory being only separated by about 100 kilometres of sea. North Korea, of course, is always rattling its missiles and nuclear capabilities. And Japan is often subjected to threatening invective from Pyongyang, and then Russia still plays its part in putting pressure upon Japan, again on the basis of those territories which the two countries dispute, the northern territories. But this has really galvanized Japan in terms of its security and defense reform. So especially under Prime Minister Abe, Japan has been determined to play a greater security role in the region, alongside allies and partners like Australia. And so it's changed a lot of its domestic legislation. In 2015, we had the new peace and security legislation that loosened some of these self-imposed historical ties upon what Japan can actually do in conflict or crisis situations. And it's also reformed its so-called defence architecture, how it organises its forces, and below that, how it's modernising its forces to meet challenges not only in the land, air and sea domains, but also in new domains such as cybersecurity, the electromagnetic spectrum and so forth. So, Japan is being very, very proactive. It calls its, contribution to international security a proactive contribution to international peace. And behind this, the pace of reform and the changes as Japan sort of becomes more of a normal security actor, being quite prolific and actually strongly supported by the Australian political and defence establishment.
Tom, how important was former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe to all those changes? Because this has happened, obviously not in a vacuum, and people unfamiliar with how Japanese bureaucracy works, it's fairly slow. But you know, there was a change of government in 2009 in Japan. From the long-standing Liberal Democratic Party to the Democratic Party of Japan, a sort of a centre-left party. But then they had a really unsuccessful term in office, 3 prime ministers, that sort of revolving door prime ministership that we've unfortunately become a bit familiar with in Australia. But they had Hatoyama, and then they had Khan, and then Prime Minister Noda, and of course in that period of time they had the earthquake tsunami crisis, which rocked the country and the stability of the country. Particularly its sort of economic progress and of course the sort of general psyche of the country was very much shocked by that period. But there was even back then discussion about changing Japan's strategic posture, but the Democratic Party of Japan leaders were not quite of the sort of ilk of Prime Minister Abe. He came in the end of 2012 with a real mandate to make Japan have a more normal strategic posture and normal set of, strategic settings, legally speaking. Was it all about Shinzo Abe, or can we see this in a kind of trajectory of Japan's posture, strategic posture, responding to the changing dynamics in Northeast Asia and the Pacific more broadly?
Yeah, so I think it is part of a long-term strategic trajectory, but I think it's sort of ebbed and flowed in terms of activity. So there's been non-stop incremental gains, probably since the end of the Cold War. But it was firstly Prime Minister Koizumi that I think sort of really made major contributions on this front. Then we had this Abe came in briefly and then had to step down 2006-07, I think. And then we had this interregnum that you pointed out where, there's a huge shock that the LDP were replaced by what was then the Democratic Party of Japan, which has since disbanded, yes. Possibly due to their hardly edifying role in government. I mean, I remember at this time that the DPJ government was really, came under a lot of criticism for being inept and lacking the experience. I mean, understandably, since there's only really been one political party in government since the end of World War II. But they were just rocked by a whole range of things. I mean, obviously quite understandable that for any government to deal with the 3/11 crisis, the triple disaster. But also one of the things that really sort of flared up was this attempt to tilt more towards China and away from the United States, and got into this huge quagmire of wanting to renegotiate US military bases in Okinawa, and then the Chinese fishing trawler ramming the Japanese Coast Guard, the Senkaku shock. That really just turned their whole administration upside down. So when Abe came in, he really had a strong mandate based upon what he originally wanted to do in his very first short term to revitalise Japan as a security actor. He used the phrase, Japan is back and so am I, to kick off his second and very long duration as Prime Minister. And so, he had a lot of things happened under his administration that were absolutely groundbreaking. I mean, just to think of a few off the top of my head, the formation of a National Security Council, like the United States and many other countries, to have this kind of control tower, as they call it, over crisis response and security policy, to lend it more direction, to centralise it within the Prime Minister's office. They published their first national security strategy document as well, which laid out that these are the challenges we face, this is how we're going to respond to it. Just gave a lot more direction to to what in the past, commentators have pointed out as a sort of a little bit sort of low profile or sort of reactive policy, much, much more proactive. And then I think, his big achievement, he has been criticised as a historical revisionist and nationalist. And that's a complex picture, but under his second term in office, this idea of an Abe doctrine, where Japan would reshape its security identity to become more proactive, to become more normal, to contribute more, to build new relationships, and to consolidate both and revise both its sort of security apparatus, its defence apparatus, and its military posture was incredibly important. And just one last thing to highlight that I mentioned earlier was this 2015 peace and security legislation, which really changed some of the sort of embedded limitations and constraints upon Japan as a security actor. In particular, allowed it to take a more proactive role in its own defence against, say, missile threats, but also allowed it to engage, very importantly, in collective self-defence, meaning that it could defend against security threats or attacks against Japan alongside the United States or other strategic partners like Australia. And so, the number of his achievements is quite an impressive portfolio. Those are just some of them. But I think also a strong leadership as well is something that, he really left his imprint on there, like Koizumi, that, this is what can be achieved with a strong Japanese leader, unlike this sort of fairly revolving door of fairly sort of lackluster or at least sort of slightly faceless leaders that we've seen in the past.
Yes, I was struck by Abe 2.0, the sort of second time round, how he, like leaders, Menzies came back a second time after resigning in 41. In 49, he came back and had a long, very successful leadership charting Australia through, the Cold War and some significant challenges, both domestically and externally. Abe the same, Howard the same, had come back again as leader of his party. But I back to your comment before about this historical revisionism. I found it interesting back when Abe was first elected in 2012 and into 13 and 14, when he was trying to get this revised interpretation of the Japanese constitution through, which was absolutely part of his mandate, and he was deeply committed to that. There was reporting in the Western press that he was, an ultra-nationalist and wanting to return Japan to a sort of militaristic posture, without realising the constitutional interpretation prior to the change Abe brought through and the changes Abe had driven, that really constrained Japan to do things that Australia as a country would take for granted, the United States would take for granted. Every other country in the world had a degree of independence of deciding, what was it, self-defence or collective self-defence, or when it could defend its interests, not necessarily on its defined territory, but there are moments when you would like to defend your interests, say, in the broader Pacific. Japan couldn't do any of that before Abe brought through these changes. So really understanding not just sort of the rhetoric or of his opponents, or of course his state opponents like China and North Korea and even South Korea. Actually understanding the substance of what he was trying to achieve. Yes, he's a Japanese patriot, that's for sure, and he has some, from an Australian perspective, there are some difficulties with his views on Japanese war history, particularly the commemoration of people who we would consider war criminals at the Yasukuni Shrine, and the impact that has on particularly its near neighbours, Korea and the like. But you want your leaders to be patriotic, surely. They're leading your country. You'd want them to love your country and defend its interests. So I was sorry he announced his retirement, and I had reasonable hopes for his successor, Prime Minister Suga, but I knew now Prime Minister Kishida as Foreign Minister. So it's good to see him in that position. I know he's a strong friend of Australia, which is a good thing from our perspective. I wanted to finish our discussion, Tom, with your thoughts on the Quad. And the Quad, I mean, it seems new, but it's actually not very new. It was a Japanese idea back in the time of the Howard government, and it had its issues with, was India really that keen on it? Was the United States as keen? And then was Australia that keen? And then Australia started winding back its interest when there was a change of government, and it was really put on ice. And of course, Abe out of power, and the DPJ being elected in 2009, it lost all momentum. But it was revived, and it's been a really interesting development in Australia's network of security relationships. And I think the bringing in of India really does open up a whole range of opportunities. But of course, with the Ukraine crisis and India's relationship with Russia, it does have its difficulties. There aren't always a confluence of interest between the Quad partners, and that's where this is a new arrangement, and it still has a fair way to go to being something that is as powerful as its potential.
Yeah, well, I think those are all very very important insights that you've just mentioned. Just to add my perspective on it. I think we've got to be a little bit careful when we approach the Quad. I mean, you're right. It's it had sort of two evolutions. I mean, the first one, Japan and Abe took a key, or those close to Abe took a key part in sort of spruiking this. So I mean, we had the talk of the confluence of two oceans in India in 2007. The whole idea of the Indo-Pacific and let's bring India in, and then sort of I think it was Foreign Minister at the time that said, the arc of freedom and prosperity. And then there was another one that was Abe's democratic security diamond. And so, this really showed that how Japan, really catalysed and was really motivated to develop the Quad. Then, of course, it was, arguably torpedoed by Prime Minister Rudd in 2007. And then this second iteration came back in 2017, of course, again, under Abe's period in office. And, I think in some ways the Quad, is basically like the trilateral strategic dialogue partners, Australia, Japan and the United States, as a core, and then sort of trying to bring India in. But India is not as close to the other three as those three are to each other. And so, there's always, it attracts attention that, India, doesn't necessarily share these interests or anything. So, often you'll find that the Quad really sort of needs to come down to the lowest common denominator. I mean, there's definitely, shared concerns about the rise of China, challenges to the rules-based order from a number of different directions. But I think you see a lot more cohesion between those three parties, US, Japan, Australia, and then India has quite different concerns. I mean, it's very worried about Pakistan, for example, whereas that is not a huge priority in terms of what, say Japan is or Australia are worried about. And, I think we've just got to be realistic about what the Quad can actually achieve. So we look at a sort of the big picture, then it's really good to have these, these four like-minded democracies with a certain degree of coincidence in their strategic interests, working together, talking. That's absolutely a good thing. Sort of brings a bit of, with India coming in, also sort of feeds to, the opportunities that countries like Japan and Australia see for economic cooperation and closer ties with India. Sort of brings that into a common kind of democratic front. But in terms of what it can actually do on the practical level, so far, it's got a bit of a mixed record. I mean, ideally, it can focus on maritime security issues, what we call maritime domain awareness, and not literally freedom of navigation, but free transit and this sort of thing, and sort of surveillance and all these kind of things in this this maritime environment of the Indo-Pacific. And they've done a lot of good work on things like pandemic response and plans for technology sharing and everything. But we've got to be a little bit cautious about, certain people have started saying, well, this is going to be an alliance, or either it's an alliance now, which is completely wrong, or that it'll develop into an alliance in the future. I think, that really remains to be seen. I think it's better to sort of see it as, intersecting bilateral relationships brought into a quadrilateral sort of dialogue format, but not just limited to dialogue. A certain degree of practical cooperation does come out of that, in contrast to some other regional organisations which have been sort of derided as talk shops for not actually producing practical results.
Yeah, and I do think the India's stance on Russia's invasion of Ukraine does give us pause for thought when it comes to what the Quad can achieve. If the Quad's shared ambition is that, you know, they're liberal democracies, the four partners, and they believe in a free and open Indo-Pacific rules-based order, but then one of the partners fails to condemn the invasion of another country. And by the way, that the country that's invaded that other country is also a Pacific country too. So, you know, if you've got to question where it is at in terms of its development, but also the potential. And I think the pressure that can be exerted on India by Quad partners will, of course, be balanced from India's perspective by the importance of the supply of arms to India by Russia and the other aspects of that relationship. So countries, you would know better than me, Tom. We live, I believe, in a world of realpolitik, and countries act on their own interests, and obviously look at the power dynamics operating in the world and make their strategic decisions based on those, and that these India's particular strategic concerns of Pakistan, of China, of course in the Indian Ocean, but it ultimately needs to defend its own territory, and it has made its decisions about what statements it makes in the international stage based on those, not based necessarily on the sort of ideological outlook it might have or a sort of a philosophical approach to international relations. So a fair bit of work to go there, I think, for the Quad. But Tom, it's been wonderful to have this chat with you today. I love talking about Japan, loved hearing all your views. So thank you very much for coming on the Afternoon Light podcast.
It's been a great pleasure. Thanks so much, Georgina.
The Afternoon Light podcast is brought to you by the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. You can find more about the Institute and our podcast at robertmenziesinstitute.org.au. We're also on Twitter, on Facebook and LinkedIn. We look forward to you joining our show next week. Thank you.